Great. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Juliet Parker. I'm the director of ALNAP, the Learning Network for the Humanitarian Sector. And I am delighted to welcome you today to this event jointly hosted by ALNAP, OCHA, UNICEF, and UNFPA, exploring how lessons from evaluation and research can help overcome systemic barriers to accountability to affected people, and how these AAP commitments can be turned into meaningful change in humanitarian responses. Despite years of commitments and activity, progress on accountability to crisis-affected people remains underwhelming. The promised participation revolution never materialized, and despite being a central issue in humanitarian discourse, the evidence repeatedly tells us that real change on the ground has been minimal. We can see there's been a proliferation of frameworks, technical working groups, and guidelines around accountability, but this has done more to formalize the issue than to improve real outcomes for affected communities. And the supply-driven nature of humanitarian aid appears to leave little room for listening and tailoring our approaches to community priorities. Our learning suggests that for too long, efforts have focused on small technical fixes rather than the systemic barriers that prevent meaningful accountability. We know, for example, that for all the positives of investing in complaints and feedback mechanisms, without addressing the political realities that limit meaningful engagement and response, the challenge isn't collecting feedback, but acting on it, especially when it falls outside pre-designed programmatic solutions or misses out on the benefits of the kind of rare, flexible funding that's required to act on feedback. But there is some evidence that good mechanisms can improve aid effectiveness and uphold dignity, which we'll hear more about today. But we need to know a lot more about what works and why, particularly in the face of the funding cuts facing the sector, which threaten to push AAP further down the priority list. So what needs to change for these commitments to be turned into meaningful action? Are we at the juncture of a fundamental reorganization of the humanitarian system that can break the cycle of limited gains on AAP? Most importantly, how can we fulfill our core promise to people affected by crises that, as Nimo will tell us shortly, is why we exist as a humanitarian community? I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but first some quick housekeeping notes. Simultaneous translation is available for this event in Arabic, French, and Spanish. In order to access the translation, please click the Translate button at the bottom of your screens. Or else, if that's not visible, you may need to first click the 3 buttons for the translation option to appear. You're invited to put your questions to our panelists throughout the event using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as possible. Please do feel free to ask questions in the language that you feel most comfortable in. You're also very welcome to introduce yourselves and to engage with other listeners using the chat function, but please do direct questions for the panelists to the Q&A. The event today is being recorded and will be available online and will be emailed to everyone who registered after the event. I think that's it for housekeeping. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today. Firstly, Nimo Hassan, the Executive Director of the Somali NGO Consortium. She has strengthened collective NGO coordination and advocacy in Somalia. She serves as Chair of the ICFA Board, represents ICFA at the ISC Principles, and co-led the development of the global ISC guidance on localization. Gemma Connell is the Chief of the Strategic Prioritization and Practices branch for OCHA, where she oversees work related to humanitarian needs assessments, appeals, and coordination. She's been with OCHA since 2011, most recently as head of OCHA's regional office for Southern and Eastern Africa and deputy head of office in South Sudan. Bushta Murabit is currently working as deputy representative with UNFPA in Syria. He's been part of UNFPA since 2007 and has served in different countries in the Middle East, Africa, and HQ in New York. His professional focus is on leading and coordinating resilience and recovery programs with a focus on many areas of inclusive programming, including on AAP. And Charles Antoine Hoffman is currently Chief of Section with UNICEF's Emergency Division, managing the Accountability to Affected People portfolio. He was previously Senior Thematic Advisor with the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat based in OCHA, Geneva. He was also the Executive Secretary of SCHR between 2009 and 2012. So we'll be speaking to all our panelists shortly, but first I'd like to hand over to Nimo for her opening reflections on the successes and barriers to AAP, and what needs to change if we're serious about putting people at the center of our work.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and thank you all of you for joining this really important and timely conversation about inclusion of affected communities. And also thank you to ALNAP for framing today's discussion so clearly. My remarks will focus on one central theme: the current state of play for accountability to affected populations, not as a technical requirement or as a box to tick, but as the core promise that defines why we exist as humanitarian community. Because accountability to affected population is not simply an obligation, it's a promise. It's a promise that every decision we make, every assessment, every allocation, every strategy will be shaped by the voices of the people we serve. What have we achieved so far? Across Somalia and across the region, we have seen what becomes possible when communities are placed at the center. Community committees identifying the most vulnerable households have reduced tension and improved fairness. Local leaders guiding agencies to safe water points have protected livestock and saved families' long journeys. These are simple acts of listening, but they show that accountability is practical, a life-saving tool. And this progress extends beyond Somalia. AAP is now firmly on agency agendas. Community feedback is shaping programs from OCHA to UNFPA, especially women and girls are intentionally included. Interagency mechanisms are demonstrating how collective accountability elevates marginalized voices. Regional innovations are emerging that can inform global practices. These successes remind us that communities are not beneficiaries. They are partners and problem solvers. But we must also tell the truth about the barriers. Progress has been slower than expected. Fragmentation persists between AAP, gender, protection, and PCA. Integration beyond humanitarian context is weak. The system lacks incentives for community-centered programming and operational realities that make it harder. Multiple crises stretch teams thin, especially those in the front lines. Late funding pushes speed over consultation. Insecurity limits engagement, and coordination structures respond to urgent pressures, which sometimes crowd out community voices in decision-making rooms. These are not failures of commitment. They reflect the difficult conditions humanitarian actors face daily. But they do reveal a leadership gap. Accountability to affected population still depends too much on individual champions, and it's not performance metric for senior managers. So, what leadership must do now? If we are serious about AAP, leadership must move from endorsement to ownership. This goes for everything that we do, to be honest, in our sector. Ensure community voices shape design, targeting, timing, and delivery. Analyze recurrent complaints collectively and act on them in a timely manner. Be transparent when aid is delayed or reduced. And above all, give national organizations the space and the resources to lead. Localization is not an add-on to accountability. It is its foundation. So what's the way forward? Especially now that during this humanitarian reset where the system is facing at the moment. So despite the shocks of global funding cuts, the humanitarian reset offers a rare and decisive opportunity to rebuild our system around people, not structures. We must embed AAP structurally, not aspirationally. Strengthen leadership accountability across the system. Leverage national innovation and community voices as drivers of change. Invest in community-led validation, ensuring people define priorities and judge our performance. This is how accountability becomes a culture, not a requirement. Somalia has shown us that resilience grows when people are heard. Communities offer insight every day. Now, the real question is, are we ready to act on it? If we commit to genuine partnerships, honest reflections, and collective action, then accountability can finally become what it was always meant to be, a shared promise made real through the people at the center of our work. Thank you, and I wish you all the best for this conversation today. Thanks. Back to Juliet.
Thank you so much, Nimo, for setting the scene for our discussion today. I'm afraid Nimo is not able to stay around for the Q&A, unfortunately, today. So, but the rest of the panelists will be. And just a reminder that as we speak to the panelists, please do feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function. Nimo reminded us that accountability is a culture, not a requirement. And that also it's what we're looking at in this transition moment in the sector is about building a system around people, not structures. We're going to be hearing from our panelists now. And first of all, I'd like to turn to Bushta to hear a little bit more, please, about your experiences in Northwest Syria. What approaches have you found that have worked well, particularly in enabling collective approaches to accountability and inform strategic decision-making?
Thank you, Juliet, and thanks to all people who are attending this very interesting discussion. And thanks to our sister Nimo, I think, who has set the stage for the discussion. I think she mentioned so many very important points. At one time is very encouraging, but also alarming about the AAP in the humanitarian sphere. When the AAP was introduced, it's really to ensure the accountability of humanitarian partners or community to the affected people by ensuring that the response, the humanitarian response is based on the need of those people who are impacted by the crisis, but also the feedback that they are communicating or raising about the quality of services, the accessibility is also helpful. Our experience in the north of Syria, it's very interesting. I think it is very encouraging initiative, and we tried really to make the AAP as culture, as it was said, but also to raise the accountability of the system to make sure that we are serving the people we are correctly. Our initiative was very simple. It's really to lead the interagency AAP initiatives by bringing, of course, the different actors, but also the different coordination forum, whether it is the ICCG, the PC network, or even, which is very important here, the risk management unit colleagues. What makes this initiative very important and successful is really the approach that were adopted from the beginning, and this is materialized through the strong leadership of the high-level coordination. Authorities at that time, which make this the AAP as part of course, the system and need to be prioritized and recognized as critical for ensuring successful interventions. This high-level leadership also was translated to turn this AAP from a simple initiative to put it as a system within the overall coordination sphere by ensuring that all the of course, the different working groups, as I say, they are also applying the AAP as important in their work. Importantly, it's the AAP was embedded in the existing coordination structures by making sure that the interagency, I mean, the approach or the how the AAP project was implemented through two main, I mean, of course, components, which is the safe line and remote tracker and face-to-face dialogue. So those two key elements was not only just to collect, I mean, information or feedback, but also to put in place a very strong system to monitor those feedback and analyze them and take immediate action on that. But importantly is really to involvement of the local communities and beneficiaries. So the project, there is the local community of practice composed mainly of the community beneficiaries, but also the community volunteers who are doing, I mean, a critical or very important role in supporting the implementation of this project. So it's the initiative has been owned by the community through making sure that they have say on the quality of services and the influence the decision making when it comes to the changing some of SOPs, guidelines, the level of, for example, health facilities or the shelter services, which I mean translated later on by improving the services. I think another important approach that has been used is really that the feedback was not only to be collected, but also to be analyzed and addressed on time. For example, the misconduct and protection concept received from systemic was received and systematically analyzed, and immediate action was taken. And I will conclude here by how it influenced the strategic decision by really, I mean, making sure that the AAP project has sustained, I mean, funding within the humanitarian, I mean, funding of the Syria humanitarian fund. So for the second year now, the project is getting funded, which is good. But of course, as Nimo said, there is need now really at this moment really to make it a leadership issue, not only just like endorsing, but really to put it on the top of discussion and the time of allocation of humanitarian funding, which I think the leadership is trying its best now to do. So this is, just a small highlight about our experience here, but which we tried really to make it a good practice and a good example for, using it or implementing in other contexts. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Rushta. And UNFPA have written this up as a case study, which is available online, and I'm sure my colleagues will put the link in the chat if they haven't already. I'd like to zoom out now and ask Gemma, in your position looking across the sector, how do you see system-wide challenges and barriers hindering effective AAP, and what practical steps do you see that humanitarian actors can take to overcome them?
Thanks so much, Juliet, and wonderful to be with everyone on this really critical topic at such a critical moment. So I want to start with the positive, which I think Nimo did as well. So I'm going to build from there and say that progress and innovation are happening, no matter the barriers, and in fact, in many instances, despite the barriers. And we see this in so many countries, in so many contexts, and the OCHA evaluation spoke to a lot of those really good practices, from the way that in Venezuela we've taken on feedback to change the food benefit, the baskets, the anti-fraud measures, conflict-sensitive messaging, based on that feedback that was brought into the interagency response, to the work done in Afghanistan on the Community Voices platform, where again, UNFPA runs the platform, OCHA brings it into the HCT, the Humanitarian Country Team, to make sure that we influence the response, and so many places in between. But Juliet, to your question, of course, there are still barriers, and the interagency brief that I just popped in the chat box for colleagues really speaks to some of these, but let me highlight just a few. I think The first is to really stress, and Nimo touched on this, as did Bushra, with the concrete way this is being done in Syria. AAP is not just about listening to people. And I think this is where we sometimes get stuck. It's about listening to people and changing the way that we work. And I loved what Nimo said about changing our mindsets as well, because the reality, and it's a harsh reality, but it is a reality, is that we do still have the legacy of a colonial mindset in the humanitarian sector. And part of what we're talking about is shifting that mindset, which is a true barrier to seeing people, as Nimo put it, as partners and problem solvers. So this piece around mindset is still critical, no matter how many years we've worked on this, no matter how far we've come. And the fact that we need to not just listen to people, but act on it is still a huge barrier. We have done so much better at listening to people in a lot of places. We have made huge progress, especially with thanks to our AAP colleagues, but also committed colleagues worldwide. But the question of whether that listening then translates into action, we see as one of the biggest barriers. What else are there? Let's be very frank. We often have mandates that conflict with people's priorities, and our ability to take what people tell us and immediately translate into a change in the response is limited based on a number of things. And those include donor priorities and donor modalities. Let's take a really concrete example. If a donor is delivering in-kind assistance and communities are telling us that they want cash, partners will struggle to make the shift that communities are calling for. So what can we do in the face of those barriers? We can be honest, we can be open, we can be transparent, because as Nimo said, if we treat people as partners, that requires us to say to them, we heard you. You said give us multi-purpose cash. We can't do that right now, and these are the reasons. This is the best we can do, and this is why. Is that something that you're willing to accept? It really requires us having those open, honest conversations which treat people as partners in the decision-making process. And I think the last thing I'd touch upon on this question, Juliet, and I'll come back with more later, as you know, but really the question of how we shift the power imbalance. And part of that goes to how we make sure there are consequences. And Nimo spoke again a bit to this, and I think Bushra spoke to how they're doing that very practically in Syria. We have consequences in the humanitarian sector for other aspects of non-performance. We have consequences if we don't deliver in accordance with an indicator. We have consequences if we don't meet targets. How do we ensure that we self-impose consequences when we are not doing what people tell us that they want and what they are prioritizing? And a part of this comes into, we have now over the years professionalized, become more sophisticated in our tools, in our processes, in the way that we work. How do we ingrain AAP in every single aspect of that, rather than seeing it as a side product or an add-on that our wonderful specialist colleagues do, but we don't listen to? Have to bring that into every single process that we run. And a big part of what we're doing at global level, Juliet, is around the humanitarian program cycle and making sure that it's truly responsive to what people tell us their priorities are and what they prefer. Let me pause there and I'll come back with more later.
Great, thank you very much. And yes, that issue of ingraining AAP into every single aspect and not treating it just as an add-on brings me to my next question for Charles Antoine, which is this recognition that AAP isn't a standalone technical area. And Nimo also made the connections between accountability and localization, but it also, of course, links with gender, D&I, all these areas. Can you tell us a bit about how this interconnection of technical areas is reflected in UNICEF's practice in its development and humanitarian work?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Juliet, and great pleasure to be on this conversation. Always pleased to support and be with ALNAP. Interestingly, I think there's already quite a sort of common themes coming through, which is not a surprise. But to your question, I think it raises two important interrelated aspects that I'd like to unpack in the next few minutes. First, the importance of leadership support, of course, and then the need to move away from a narrow technical understanding of AAP. And I would say instead frame it as part of quality programming, as you've put it in your question. So let me first turn to the role of leadership, which I think is the most important point in my view. And it came clearly in our recent evaluation as well as in the AAP audits that we went through last year. And I personally strongly believe that accountability is and must be a management responsibility rather than a technical area only, as we sometimes look at it. So in UNICEF, we see more and more country representatives and colleagues who are strong AAP champions, and we definitely see a correlation between leadership support and the progress we've seen over the years on AAP. To give some examples, the fact that the AAP focal point in a country reports to the representative or deputy representative, that AAP is regularly on the agenda of management meetings where community feedback is discussed, and then that an office-wide approach is promoted. All of that is largely the result of strong leadership support. And it is generally in those contexts that the views and feedback from communities are taken seriously to inform program design and course correction. And I think we've documented within UNICEF, but also across the board at the interagency level, and Gemma was mentioning this recent paper we produced. We've documented this progress quite well. However, the challenge is that this remains largely down to individuals and to leadership, as I was saying. So how can we ensure that this becomes part and parcel of how we work? And we have made significant efforts to integrate those elements, AAP commitments, into planning and monitoring processes. But much more is needed, in my view. Those principles have to become part of the organizational culture, and that term was used before by the other panelists as well. And I think leaders' performance must be assessed against those commitments. And the AAP evaluation that was conducted recently for UNICEF makes some important recommendations in that sense. And on my second point, which is on the need to frame AAP as part of a broader quality and accountable and inclusive programming, I think we have probably gone too far in promoting AAP as a standalone technical area of expertise that requires dedicated capacity. And I think to some extent we are missing the point here. I have heard time and time again from my country colleagues that they have no issue regarding our commitments to AAP, and in the same way, of course, localization, gender, disability, inclusion, or PSCA. And I think the commitments are very clear and are definitely there. But the challenge I'm hearing lies more with the fact that these different cross-cutting issues, as we sometimes call them, come each with their own set of expectations, with pages and pages of guidance, multiple technical support, and a significant number of indicators they have to track every year. So there is only so much a country office can absorb, despite all the goodwill that we've seen. And I think this is particularly the case in the current environment for obvious reasons and the massive cuts that we all have to go through. So I believe this is our responsibility to come up with some solutions to break some of these silos, promote a more coherent and simple approach towards quality programming. And honestly, that was not a surprise that the first two recommendations from the evaluation I mentioned actually focus on the need for more coherent, people-centered approach. And we have started working in this direction. I don't particularly like the term going back to basics, but I think that there's a serious need to simplify and focus on what is essential for the people we serve. Also more to come in the next few questions, but I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, a more coherent and simpler approach. It'd be great to pick up what that means maybe a bit later in the discussion also. Gemma, I'm going to come back to you on the issue of leadership, and this is a tasty question. I'm really looking forward to this one. So much when we're looking at learning within ALNAP, and if anything around kind of systemic learning comes down to this issue of leadership. And it's a really difficult one to address, but I wanted to hear from you on how important is leadership for ensuring humanitarian responses are accountable, and most importantly, who should provide that leadership? Where does it sit?
Yeah, thank you so much, Juliet. So I think the first point here is to remind us that all of us are leaders. You know, in the discussions we have in humanitarian action, we very often come back to humanitarian coordinators who I do believe have a critical role to play on this issue, be it the way that they manage the pooled funds that come under their leadership and making sure that, for example, in Niger, under the flagship initiative, the pooled funds did an allocation driven from the start by people's preferences and priorities. HCs have the ability to set the direction of travel on the pooled funds. HCs have the ability to set the direction of travel on an overall response and to ask some of these tricky questions about if we're not responding in accordance with people's priorities, why not? And what are we going to do about it? And how do we communicate back to them? The HCs can do all of that, but the HC is one person. And all of our discussion in the reset is about the fact that leadership needs to be collective. And so what I would really bring to this is a couple of things. Number one, this is the responsibility of every head of every organization, be that a local organization, international organization, UN, NGO, in any country where we work. Everyone who is in a leadership position has the responsibility to take this issue seriously. And when I say take it seriously, I don't mean only within their own organization, because to go back to the barriers question, one of the biggest barriers we've had over the years is we've actually gotten better at dealing with this within our own organizations. But when it comes to collective, we're afraid of feedback. We're afraid of feedback that's shared. We're afraid of what the consequences will be. So it means that every single person in a leadership position in a humanitarian operation has the obligation to be radically transparent, to find the way to have these discussions, and to do so in a way that puts people over mandates, that put people over any of our other priorities. So this is really about collective leadership. And again, here, I would say in the OCHA evaluation, we've really looked at this from the perspective, and this builds on what Charles-Antoine was just saying, there's the head of office responsibility, but there's also the responsibility in every single function in the way that we work. So I spoke a little bit to pooled funds. We've also had this incredible exercise of the Central Emergency Response Fund, the CERF, giving $10 million to 16 operations to promote collective AAP. So the pooled funds are really carrying their weight in driving this forward. But in the humanitarian program cycle, which I lead on globally, how are we ensuring that it's there? And how do we make sure that every focal point who runs the HPC has this at the core? Information management, data responsibility, making sure that we can bring all of this information together and really drive responses with what people are telling us. Again, that requires leadership from our information management officers. So it is not a cop-out, Juliet, quite the contrary. It's to say that if we're going to make progress, we have to take this at every level of every response. It cannot be the HC alone, though the HC, the humanitarian coordinator, for those who don't know the HC acronym, the HC has that critical leadership role to play, but so too does the HC need to listen, and listen to local actors in particular, as Nimo said at the beginning. And we all in between those spheres have a responsibility to play at every single level. I just want to give a couple of examples of what's possible when we do lead on this from Colombia, where again, the flagship initiative focused on community consultations that led to the co-design of the response with people impacted by the crises, to Burkina Faso, where again, the collective decided to invest in this and to go to the point of how we bring in gender and inclusion and don't just see these things in silos, but really accountability as the umbrella under which they all fall. We saw women-led community groups being equipped with phones to provide feedback. And again, that was done in a really collective way that enabled it to drive the response, through to Haiti, where participatory assessments with marginalized groups made sure that we were listening to everyone. But again, for me, Juliet, the big piece here, and then I promise to stop, is how do we take the advances we've had in the technical work, in the way that we do AAP, the tools, the feedback mechanisms, the consultative platforms. We see across countries so many innovations, but the big question is, are we changing our responses? And for that, I do look to the HC. I do look to the HCT, and I also look at all of us globally, because at the global level, we've a responsibility to empower our colleagues working on the ground in different country contexts to get this right, to drive responses based on what people are telling them, to adapt responses based on the feedback they receive, and to do better every single year. Back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, and a good reminder of the gains we're making, but the emphasis on then the adaptive management approaches, the ability to then be able to respond and take responsibility for making the changes based on what we're hearing through the mechanisms that we've put in place. I want to move now to Bushra. Just before I do, one reminder to the panelists, keep an eye on the Q&A function, because there's some really good questions coming up. So keep an eye out, and if there's any that you're keen to respond to, then be ready to flag those. The other is also just to highlight again the OCHA evaluation on AAP that came out earlier this year. It's really good. It has an excellent executive summary, and I'm sure my colleagues will put the link for it in the chat shortly, but well worth a look. Now I'd like to turn to Bushra. So, looking forward, and sorry, 1 second. There we go. Given the current challenges facing the sector, what recommendations do you have for how we can safeguard and build upon the progress that's been made in advancing collective approaches to AAP in your ongoing work with women and girls, and how do we ensure the sustainability of this work?
Thank you. Interesting question, and I think this is very clear. You can see that how it's getting very good discussion. Yeah, looking at the recommendation, reading of course on our model, which as you already mentioned is published and was recognized as one of the best practices in the SHARE report for 2024. If we look at the recommendation related to sustain it, make it more, duplicated, if you can say. The issue of leadership, it has been, touched upon by different colleagues, but it remains, necessary if you want really to ensure good, program or colleague. What do you mean by leadership? Is not only, as I think it was already mentioned, it's not only the leadership HC on the ground, but it's really global leadership, including not only at country level by the HC, but also within the different organizations. I think most of the organizations, they don't have like dedicated staff, for example, when it comes to AAP. It's only focal point, or maybe something that you need you to go to that working group or task force or whatever. It has to be recognized as one of the core, work if you want really to deliver on the need of people we are serving. But also at the global level, look now at the humanitarian is taking place. Where is the AAP within this discussion? Where is it put? Is it just left at the country level for establishing a task force to coordinate this, or there is strong leadership at the global level to position AAP within the humanitarian reset and reform? So the leadership is very important. And when we look at our experience before, if the project or the initiative succeeded because of the strong leadership of the regional humanitarian coordinator at that time, who really took the strong initiative really to institutionalize the AAP within the humanitarian response coordination system. But also another recommendation, I think, which is very important. We speak about the AAP is the main purpose is really to meet the needs and answer the feedback of the people of need. And we cannot do that without having the community who are serving themselves to own this work. So we should stop that just recording when we need to make our report, submit to the donors that we have consulted, we have put some different mechanisms to get the feedback. But the people who are serving it don't just need to be consulted, they have to be part of the decision making. And to do that, they have to own the initiatives. And I think this is one of the important recommendation. And looking also from our experience, I think continuing to integrating the AAP with, for example, the PC, the risk mitigation program or work, the Gender and Inclusion Working Group, and other working groups. They should feel like the AAP is cross-cutting at the end. It's the responsibility of all the sectors and all the working groups that exist at the country level. So it has to be integrated so we can make sure that the people who are serving within the two different sectors are satisfied with our services. Another very important, I think, and again, I am talking about our experience here in Syria, where UNFPA stood up and really said, we are ready to take over this joint interesting initiative. And we believed it, and we believed it, of course, on our comparative advantage and successful experience in different contexts. So in Syria, high-level commitment from UNFPA leadership to really to position and to play a critical role in coordinating the AAP. So choosing the right, partner to coordinate and lead this on behalf of the humanitarian community is very important. And last but not there are so many, but I just want really to highlight the issue of the sustaining the funding. It's very important. We have very good initiative, of course. We went during the UN donors briefing and we presented the initiative, which raised, high interest by all the donors present in that meeting, and the recommendation was made to really to keep this initiative going on and prioritize their funding. Based on that, we have worked on the second phase of this project, but unfortunately, we are yet to get the funding confirmation. We are in discussion, of course, with the RC and the HC office, and with OCHA, and of course, approaching different donors. So sustaining funding, it's very important because mostly donors, and even the allocation of the pool fund or humanitarian fund at country level goes to different sectors. But it has from the beginning made it very clear that we need some funding or funding to be kept for the AAP if you want to sustain that. So in brief, I think there are so many recommendations that we can make, but I can summarize them: strong leadership, ownership by the local community, integration within the PCA, risk mitigation, or gender and inclusion, and other working group, plus of course choosing the right partner and sustaining funding. So this, some of the key recommendations I can put here on the table, but happy to answer any further question later. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I hope, I think your audio was a little fuzzy to start with. There are a few comments in the chat, but I think it got better as you leaned forward. So maybe for the next session, that would help as well. Yeah, you mentioned sustainability of funding, and I can see there's a few questions coming up in the Q&A around resources, and clearly that's an issue that's on everybody's mind at the moment, and maybe one that we'll come back to. I'm going to pass to Charles Antoine for a question, but Gemma, just a heads up, I'm suggesting that we come back to you after Charles Antoine, if that's all right, if there's a couple of issues that you might want to pick up from the Q&A. So Charles Antoine, oh my goodness, AAP and localization are not new ideas by any means. And in the current humanitarian reset, the funding environment, of course, is forcing us to walk the talk. From what you've seen, how do we give action to long-held commitments and make sure that these perspectives of affected people play a meaningful role in our work?
Thank you, Juliet. And indeed, AAP and localization are definitely not new ideas. And to be honest, over the last 20 years, I've seen multiple reforms in the humanitarian sector, the transformative agenda, the cluster system, the ground bargain with the participation revolution, etc. And I'm not sure I'm putting that in the right order, but you see what I'm talking about. And through all these different reform efforts, we've seen, unfortunately, fairly limited progress on AAP in particular, and obviously this is quite frustrating. So I guess the legitimate question here is, what would be different this time with the humanitarian reset? How confident are we that things will be different? And I can see at least two reasons why I think we can be more optimistic, which seems a little bit odd to say in the current, very difficult context. So maybe a caveat here. But nonetheless, I think there are some elements to flag up. First, I think the shocks we are seeing in the humanitarian sector make these reforms inevitable. The push for more efficiencies, more coherence, greater collaboration is no longer a nice proposition that we've been talking about for years, but it is becoming essential and, to some extent, unquestionable. I don't think there are many other options out there, at least to a large extent. And in this context, the need to break some of the silos I was talking about before between AAP, localization, PSCA, disability inclusion, etc. The need to reduce the hundreds of pages of guidance that we've seen proliferating over the years, the need to reduce the multiplication of coordination platforms at country level, all of that is becoming quite obvious. And to be honest, I think those conversations started before the humanitarian reset, and I remember some IAC, so at global level in my case, but some IAC discussions where I think there was a growing sense of frustration that we can't continue working in the same way, and there's now definitely a stronger focus at country level around simplification, around getting to the core of what we should do in our sector. And then secondly, I would say I think that the drive for efficiencies can also lead to some more collective action. Again, that's not a new idea. There's been some good progress over the years, but always a bit of a second thought, to be very frank. And I think the conditions now seem to be hopefully there to move a little bit faster and in a more decisive manner in this direction. To just pick an example, everyone knows about the issue around the proliferation of complaints and feedback mechanisms. I remember being given the figure of the number of feedback mechanisms following the earthquake in Turkey, and I think that was over 50. So all of that means that having a common approach becomes may become the only viable option. Maybe we can go back to some of the thinking that took place in the past around some common services. What are the things we could do together? What are the things where we don't need every single organization to do the same thing? And with the consequences we've seen in the past of over-assessing or soliciting communities. So I think that there's room for hopefully faster progress. Again, in a negative context, but at least let's look at the positive side of things. I guess the aspect where I'm slightly less optimistic, which is the devolved section of the humanitarian reset, for those who have looked at the document, which covers both AAP and localization, is really the extent to which this reform will lead to real meaningful changes, or whether that will remain by and large good intentions and to some extent tokenistic. And I think the jury is still out, of course, but again, as I was saying before, there are some good conditions to really make this important step and really shift to actions, as you put it in your question. But we will also need some sort of qualitative performance matrix to see whether those intentions indeed translate into concrete action. And maybe ask the more difficult question, which is, to what extent do we need some more robust external scrutiny to keep ourselves accountable to our commitments? And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I saw that there was a question in the Q&A along those lines. So that, I think that's the sort of thinking that we need to have if we really want to move towards some more concrete action. And I often quote the IEC principle statement on AAP, which states we must be instructed by people. And I find this phrase very powerful, but it reads very well on paper. And I often say, do we actually realize the level of transformation that this would require in the way we work in this sector? And I think this is a core element of accountability, of course. But to finish on a more positive note, I'd like to note that there's been some very good progress, of course, and we tried with a group of colleagues to document that in this advocacy brief that Gemma mentioned just before. And we've seen, a range of specific examples where the community feedback informed in a very meaningful manner the humanitarian response in Venezuela, Cameroon, Northwest Syria, Afghanistan, to name a few countries. So maybe we just need to make sure that, just is a bit of an ambitious term, but we need to make sure that those examples become the norm rather than the exception. And I think that's really at the core of what we need to see. Back to you, Juliet.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, your mention of common services was really interesting. And I noticed also you gave a shout out to the CHS in one of your responses to the questions as, you know, a well-functioning common framework that could be further built on and rallied around also. And I think, yeah, interesting question around, do we understand the level of transformation that we're actually asking of ourselves? Have we actually thought, you know, really thought through what it would mean for each of us? Gemma, I'm going to pass to you. We are brilliantly ahead of time, which means we have plenty of time to relax and enjoy poring over some of the questions that people have put in the Q&A. But I'll pass to you first and see which areas you'd like to pick up.
Fantastic. I was still scrolling through them, and thank you, colleagues and friends, because as Juliet said, there's some really rich questions there. So maybe let me start with a few different pieces. I think one, I want to get to this piece around we are in a resource-constrained environment. What does that mean? And how do we grapple with that now? And I want to break that down into two pieces. One is the piece around what that means for our ability to deliver what people prefer in this environment where we have extremely limited resources. And two is what it means for our organizational approach to AAP. So on the first point, how do we ensure that we still carry, embed, and uphold AAP at a time when humanitarian resources have been catastrophically cut? We all know this, but just to put it into context, we have collectively 40% less funding right now than we did at the same point last year. And that means thousands of jobs have been cut, hundreds of clinics have been closed. You all know this, but it is important that we ground today's conversation in that reality. Rations have been cut. People who are recently displaced in Haiti no longer have access to hot meals. It goes in every single context with devastating consequences for communities. So within that context of such a seismic contraction of humanitarian resources and humanitarian presence, how do we deliver on this? Well, we would posit that this is really about this element of transparency and honesty. So as we go to communities, as we hear the feedback, and as we look at what we can and cannot deliver, sometimes we will be able to deliver what people are telling us are their priorities and preferences. And sometimes, if we're honest, and we need to be, we won't be able to. And for us, a big piece in this is that co-creation of a response with affected communities. And I often, and colleagues kill me for this, but for me, I take the example of if I have $10, what do you want me to do with that $10? It's not what would you want me to do in general if I could do anything, but I have $10. So what would you prefer with that $10? And that really practical conversation with a community can build the program from the get-go rather than us making assumptions about what the priorities would or should be with a drastically reduced amount of resources available. And if we can't deliver on the priorities, which might be advanced education, or it might be a type of livelihood that we can't deliver today, or we can't do cash programming because the government in the country have said, no, you cannot do cash programming. If that happens, again, it's that honesty, that openness to say, we can't do this and this is why in this context, either because we don't have the resources, because we don't have the permission, etc. So really bringing it back, co-creating the decision and coming back when we can't implement what is the preference. So that is one big piece in this dramatically resource constrained environment. The second is this question of specialization versus mainstream. And I want to come there to a couple of pieces. One is, and I was just putting a message in the chat around this, I do believe that specialization and dedicated funding can be catalytic, which is to say that when we have amazing colleagues like many of you online who know this issue inside out and advise on how we do it well, that is really important. When we have dedicated funds like the SURF allocation that was catalytic for collective accountability to affected people in 16 countries, again, that can really spur progress. But, and it's a big but, I would also challenge us all that those things, that dedicated expertise, that dedicated funding can and must be catalytic, not the norm, because it is unrealistic in this environment to think that a lot of this will continue. So catalytic, injections of funding, injections of capacity, followed by, through that, a fully committed effort across the system to do this differently. So that's the piece on the resources that I wanted to come back to. And Juliet, just before I hand it back, and I have others I'd love to come back to, but a couple of other pieces. One, there were some questions around how we change the incentive with donors and how we do this differently. And a colleague in the Q&A had put, we often in front of donors speak about what works best, who performs best, and that we're not really looking at this question of whether or not we are doing what communities are telling us to do. A lot of donors are really committed to this change. They face their own upstream challenges. But the big piece for me here, and someone, I think it was Tasneem in the chat, spoke to the question of collective accountability. Big change will come from us if we truly come at this collectively, which is to say, if we stop this from being a competition of which actor looks best in front of a donor and really transform this conversation into, are we as a humanitarian community responding to what people are telling us, is really the question. If we're able ourselves to shift that dynamic, we can come to the donors with a lot more pressure from our side. So I want to see us as agents in this change. And then when the donors tell us they have challenges, let's work with them to address those challenges, provide evidence, challenge assumptions, and do what we can to support them in advocacy back in their own capitals, in their own communities, to really change the way that we do things. I have a lot more, but Juliet, let me stop there and happy to come back later.
Great, thank you very much. And I can see there's more and more questions in the Q&A, so keep an eye on those as well. Charles Antoine, you put your hand up. You want to come back on something that Gemma said?
Yes, hopefully I'm not breaking the flow, but just to pick on this point about catalytic funding, which I fully agree with, but I think that there's a bit of a risk we need to be mindful of, which is, we've seen that sometimes, not necessarily with the SURF. I think the SURF has definitely played an important role to push AAP and come up with something that works in different countries. But sometimes also some donors were investing massively, or not massively, but significantly on some various approaches on AAP. And then after 1 or 2 years, the funding dries down and everything seems to be collapsing. So for me, there's also a question around, what is a realistic approach, be it at the level of different organizations or ideally the collective level, what makes sense in a sustainable manner? What is the bare minimum? Because I think we need to find a good balance between this notion that we need to integrate AP commitments as much as we can, and that's definitely important. We don't need to have, hugely sophisticated technical expertise, and we can't afford this anyway. So striking the right balance, but probably with also a way to look at it from a more sustainable angle. Because I think my own experience over the years has really been, you have a country where things go extremely well. You always have this mix between leadership, commitment, resources, and technical capacity. When those three things are together, I mean, there's no question things work. You remove one of them, and then things collapse. And the number of times I've seen, in countries where they had very sophisticated systems, and then a year later you realize actually nobody remember. I've seen that myself in Haiti where the same happened. So for me, the question is also about, you know, what is reasonable, what should reasonably be expected over the long term, even if we work in humanitarian action. I think that there are questions around that, and we should definitely ask ourselves those questions as well. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much. Bushra, maybe I'll pass to you. There are a couple of points that you want to pick up from in the Q&A.
Sure, and thank you. Very interesting questions and very relevant as well. I just took two of them that I want really to highlight on, but there are so many questions that also deserve, clarifications. There is the question from Matthew on bringing donors to the table. And I think when I was speaking about some of the recommendations, funding sustainability for this work, I'm referring to our experience here, which I'm sure that in other contexts also it's being done. This regular donors briefing is very important between the UN or the HCT in general and donors. I think it's very important. And when this briefing is taking place, the APA should be, one of the key agenda items for discussion and briefing as well. But also, donors, of course, there are so many priorities, but although the IP is the responsibility of everyone, but to make them, also responsive to this issue, I think you have to keep them informed about what's going on when it comes to the AAP. Most of the donors, they put it as a requirement when you are submitting, for example, your proposal to donors. Some of them, they required how you are going to integrate or address the issue of the AAP. So that shows their interest, but others, it's not particularly the flexible donors. So regular updates, sharing information, progress on the achievement regarding the AAP challenges. I think the donors will be happy to hear such things, but also to be put in the agenda at the HCT and the different donors briefing. These, I think, some of the good practice that can be done to ensure the donors are on board all the time. Another question, I think it was about localization from Lewis and the relation between localization and AAP and how each one is reinforcing each other. Of course, localization is very important and it helps, of course, to advance the AAP. But when we speak about localization, as if you link it to the grant bargain and allocating 25% of funding to local NGOs, but when you speak about the AAP, it's not about number of or percentage of humanitarian funding that goes to local NGOs. It's about to what extent the beneficiaries that are being served, whether by local partner or international partners, are satisfied by our services. But the reality, even though the international partners, NGOs or the UN agencies, they are operating through local, service providers. So if the service is not provided, well, because the local providers, they are not providing quality services. And therefore, when you speak about localization, you have to be very careful. Of course, supporting local NGOs that to provide those services, but without having the local, the community beneficiaries themselves owning the humanitarian response, having say on the quality of services. The localization agenda, doesn't help in this case, because at the end, what beneficiaries look forward is to get access to quality services that is on time and respond to their needs, not just like impose on them. I have also some feedback on of course, the need to allocate the 25% minimum from humanitarian funding to local partners. This, of course, can differ from one context to another. I can speak from my experience in one of the countries where the allocation from humanitarian funding was 4% only, simply because there is no strong local capacity on the ground. You cannot just throw the money to local partners that they don't have a strong system, to implement and report, monitor, and use efficiently the humanitarian funding. OCHA, I think, through the humanitarian funding colleagues, they are doing their best to sure that we have strong local partners, but we have also to be very careful. Without having strong local partners on the ground, I mean, giving money or increasing the percentage or the threshold to local partners is not all the time helpful. If we are talking about humanitarian, the AAP, which is to serve, I mean, the beneficiaries that they look for quality services, regardless who's providing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. Those of you online, do keep an eye on the answers that the panelists are very rapidly typing into the Q&A, because there's lots of interesting information there. I just wanted to pick up particularly on a repeated theme around this tension between what the system is ready and able to provide and what communities are prioritizing or asking of the system, and how to manage this tension. And both Charles Antoine and Gemma, you've put some answers in the Q&A as well, but I wondered if one of you would be willing to speak a little more on that.
I'm happy to kick off, Juliet, and was just putting another response in the chat as well. I think that this is a reality. I also think that we need to have some clear red lines. For example, let's not give communities what they don't want. So if a community is telling us, do not bring us this or that, you know, a plastic top or a food ration or a livelihood, a fishing kit, if they're telling us don't, or a dignity kit, they may not want things for reasons that they know. And sometimes still, because of the challenges we have in our system and the funding streams and everything else, that might be the only thing we have to give. And sometimes we think it's better to give something than nothing, and on we go. I think the core standard here would be, let's not give what people don't want. But again, that is really challenging, because we as humanitarians exist to try and serve people in crisis. Not perfectly, we know that, with all of the shortcomings and the barriers we've discussed in this panel, but we do feel a very strong imperative, it's our humanity, I hope, to deliver. And so we have to be able to stop ourselves in our tracks and say, nope, community has said they do not want this. We don't have anything else. We need to sit down and have that conversation where we say, okay, we heard you. We can't deliver anything else right now. Is that what you want? And if that's what they want, then we have to find a way to respect that, right? This is really about, you know, I think cynically we could say we're driven by metrics and delivery, et cetera. I think that sometimes is true. More altruistically, I would say we're driven by the fact that we all exist in this sector to deliver, and we find it hard to stop. So I think that is point number one. And point number two, I think I've already said, so forgive me for repeating it, but really this point around how we ensure that we go back with the honest answer. It's the honesty at the end of the day that really comes through. And I was just putting a message in the responses to the Q&A, because colleagues have also contrasted what we can do in an emergency response with the longer term. And I would encourage all of us to look at that as two sides of a coin rather than one piece together. Why? We can do better, must do better in our emergency responses themselves. So even in the short-term piece, how do we do what people are telling us are their priorities and preferences, and how are we honest when we can't deliver against their priorities and preferences? That is already a challenge that we have yet to fully meet around the world. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is where those communities that we serve are telling us either that they may have transitioned to a point where they have different needs than we have been delivering. This is particularly the case where maybe the conflicts died down and they no longer want an emergency response because it's been several years or even several months. So the situation may have changed, and therefore what they want and prefer may have changed because the situation has, or other reasons. Where that is the case, we need to be the conduit for carrying that information to those who can deliver on the things we may not be able to. That may be the authorities, maybe, we hope, in certain instances, be they government or non-government, but the authorities should be held to account for delivering for their people. It may be development actors who only do development work, big infrastructure projects and whatnot. And it may be many of the partners who are dual mandated actors to take this from one side of the house to the other side of the house to say, this is what these communities now prefer. I prefer to delineate that, Juliet and colleagues, because I still think we have a lot of work to do on the emergency response side and getting it right. And I don't think that contradicts having a responsibility to take feedback to other actors who have the responsibility and the mandate to deliver on things that we are not able to deliver on nor mandated to do so. I hope that helps, and back to you for now.
Yes, yeah, extremely interesting. Charles-Antoine, I can see you nodding your head at various points during that. I wonder if you want to add anything further.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was a very good and comprehensive response. So I don't have a lot to add, but and I agree with what Gemma said. I think we also have, for me, there is also another side of the coin, which is, particularly in the current situation, it's not just about what we can deliver and what people expect, and how do we find a sort of agreement or compromise in the middle or not. And I agree with this point about also defining some red lines, etc. But I can see the issue as well about our own limitations in the current context. And how do we handle situations where we do have to make very hard choices, where we cannot cover a pretty large part of the population. And for me, accountability is not just about those we can serve because they are part of the plan. It's also about vis-a-vis the broader population and the needs they have, and increasingly we'll have to make those difficult choices. I think this is also raising another range of questions, and I fear sometimes that what I've heard in the past is, what's the point of seeking feedback? Because if we cannot provide what people expect in the first place, we may as well not ask. And I think in the current context, the real danger would be to almost get rid of our commitments because we know in the first place that there are serious limitations. And I would look at it from the exact opposite angle to say that should make us even more accountable. But creating the space for this dialogue, etc., for me is important. Despite all of that, I think, and I read that in the ALNAP paper. I think that's also coming quite clearly in this recent paper that was shared in the chat box. The fact that the sector is still very supply driven, I'm stating the obvious here, but I think the shift is probably along those lines. I'm responding to the question around donors, so I won't come back to that. I remember in DRC a few years ago when I had that conversation with colleagues, and it's so easy to do the same things every year, and they knew what people were saying. They knew that they had different expectations. But where is this conversation taking place? Where is the management discussing that and engaging with donors or partners? Advocating to other organizations, etc. So I think there's still a long way to go in some ways, but just to flag up a few additional points.
Thank you very much. There's a question I'd like on the chat here that I'd like to ask, actually. The presenters have spoken about integrating AAP into organizations, systems, and culture. But what about stripping back and reducing the other demands and requirements that are taking precedence over working with communities? How willing are organizations to remove certain internal demands? I wonder if anyone would be willing to pick that one up. Yeah, Bushra, go ahead.
I can try. Thank you for colleague who asked this question. And the ultimate goal of all of us at the end is really to serve people we are trying to help and make them happy about the service we are providing to them. But it's not only one person, party or entity or organization that provide that services. And therefore, if we are specialized in one area, let's say, for example, in health or GBV or food, whatever, colleagues who are specialized in providing that services, they can do their best. They collect the feedback, or they do the assessment before going to collect, to get the information about how the service should be made. But they may not know from the other angle, for example, the issue of the SIA, the issue of gender inclusion. They may not have that expertise. Therefore, it's very important that we are working together and having the expert on this area with us in this work. And without making sure that, I'm going to say it's very important that the community we are serving, they should be, of course, as owner of the humanitarian services they are getting, but also are part of an open and transparent dialogue that we can maintain through, of course, different assessment, focus group discussion, sitting with them and get the services. So there is no way that we should really disconnect, the AAP practitioners from the other, because things are interrelated. And we need at the end that beneficiary that's satisfied from services, from the people who provide that services, but also on the time and the quality of the services they are getting. So we cannot disconnect these two. When it comes to requirements from specific agencies, I think all of us really, when it comes to the AP, it's still like treated as, focal point person, or we don't have fund for that. So I think it's time maybe really to look at it seriously and see how we can take it, more serious in our, staffing and budget allocation. I think this is very critical. But what I want to say is really we have to maintain that open dialogue with the people we are serving and the community, so to avoid and prevent any unwanted feedback later on. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, keeping the open dialogue, and there's been several mentions of the need for honesty within that open dialogue also. I'm going to ask the panelists, I think we've just got a little bit of time left, if they can have a quick review and see if there are other points that they want to pick up and respond on to. And whilst they do that, I'm just going to also remind everyone listening in that there will be a recording of this session that we'll share by email to everyone that registered after the session is finished. And also I've seen some people asking about the chat. We'll see if we can pick out comments from the chat or save comments from the chat also, because there's a lot of rich comments in there. To the panel, in the wealth of questions that have been fired at you, are there any last ones that you'd like to pick up? Any kind of key themes in particular that you think we haven't sufficiently covered or explored in this session?
Maybe, Juliet, I might kind of go back to the positive for a moment, because I think we've focused on a lot of the challenges, but you've heard Bushra, you've heard Charles-Antoine, you've heard me. There are a lot of good practices, not saying that any of them are perfect. And I think this was what, through the OCHA evaluation, we learned, right? There were a lot of good practices kind of emerging in different operations that really are contextualized, because as a colleague put in the chat, what works in one country and even in one area of one country won't work in another country or another area of that country. So it's not to say we can take and lift and replicate a good practice elsewhere, but it is to say there is a lot of emerging good practice. And I think we need to be heartened by that. And the question then is, how do we now take that and make sure that it's not one or two good practices in isolation, but this collective commitment in every place that we work to do this and to get it right in the context? And again, I know colleagues may be cynical, but I will say, I think that the big catalysts here are Number one, when we do it collectively. To go back to what Charles-Antoine said earlier, having hundreds of different complaints and feedback mechanisms will not change the way that we're working. It may change one individual organization's individual approach to an individual program, and that's still important, but it's not going to fundamentally shift what we're doing. So doing this collectively, bringing it together, being willing to look at each response, what's and all, what have we done well, what has not gone well in the eyes of the people who we exist to serve. That is, in my mind, hugely important. And I know there was a colleague who was skeptical about the collective piece in the chat and saying sometimes it can bring us down to the lowest common denominator. I would say that it is the beginning of bringing us up to the ceiling, because as long as we're off in individual organizational silos, I actually think that the floor of a collective approach is the ceiling of an individual approach. So when we shift to the collective and we're willing, open, able to have these conversations, we really do see change. We have to accept that sometimes it might take more time. Because in Niger, for example, where the pooled fund really co-created the response with people for an allocation, that took more time than one of our usual allocations, because it meant being deliberate and going back and forth in an iterative process to get it right. And so one of our other metrics of how quickly can we do things was challenged by, can we do this in a way that truly co-creates with people? So we've got to be open to having different metrics maybe pull at each other as we get this right. But again, I think I would really just stress that we can get it right. And I really want to stress that this applies to the emergency response, because there was a colleague in the chat who was saying, maybe it's not worth it because people's priorities ultimately are usually the longer term. That is absolutely true. Every human on this planet has aspirations that are bigger than surviving today. However, as I speak as someone whose sole job is humanitarian, so I self-declare my interest here, but in the humanitarian phase of a response, we still can do things differently on if we're truly accountable to affected people. So I really urge us to break that up and look at it. And Juliet, you had one last question, which I've forgotten, but I'm happy to come back on it if I missed it. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Charles-Antoine. You've got your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to share a reflection, because there's been lots of very interesting questions on discussion and comments and so on, but it also touches on a wide range of aspects. And I was just reflecting on that because, in a way, I remember when I don't know if it's a change or something else, but I was lucky enough to be, along the journey, the AAP journey of UNICEF, starting back quite a number of years ago. And I remember at the time when we first designed the sort of initial framework to define what that means for UNICEF, one of the regional directors said we're actually talking about a cultural change in the organization. So it goes much further than another technical area, as I was saying before. But the fact that we went through a recent evaluation, and again through that good work, there's a large number of recommendations and findings which touch on again a very broad range of elements. The entire organization, in some ways, there are elements around planning, monitoring, the elements around the role of leadership, around HR, obviously around programs and the quality of programs, around the different sectors, and so on and so forth. So just to say, because the conversation and the challenges may seem quite overwhelming, but maybe it's good to remind ourselves that this is actually at the core of the organizational culture and the way we work. And that's probably also what keeps me optimistic, because unlike some other areas where maybe changes are easier, faster, again, the sole fact that this is touching on the very central elements of an organization mean those changes take time. And maybe we need to be more patient. I definitely don't think, the day I become cynical about this, it's probably time to go or move on. But yeah, the time frame might be slightly different with this realization as well.
Thank you very much. Bushta.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is a question from Taslim on the experience in Syria about the resource constraint, which I think all of us will have very clearly mentioned that the issue of funding and resources is the issue. For us here in Syria and building of that experience, yes, the funding and the resource constraint is still there, although there is high interest from donors. But we, as I spoke before, the community of practice has been doing a great job, of course, to be part of the process of decision making when it comes to changing the quality of influencing, changing the quality of services and the behavior of some of the service providers, which I think very critical when it comes to how the services are provided. But just I want also to conclude with highlighting 2 points. That the AAP is, of course, the responsibility of everyone. It's not one agency or one entity, and therefore it has to be, institutionalized as a system within the humanitarian program. If it is at the HCT or the RC itself, I can speak, for example, here in Syria, where the AAP task force has double line of reporting. It reports to the HCT and the HC on the part of the humanitarian program, but also it reports to the UNCT for the development and recovery ongoing program. So this is something I think very good. It has to continue to be put at the system. And of course, maintain within the coordination structure. We're talking about this humanitarian reset now, and it has really not to be forgotten and put aside as the last issue to talk about, while just focusing on the 8 clusters. And lastly, and the last point is really funding issue. Funding is critical if you want really to talk about successful, AAP framework that supports the beneficiaries we are serving to get the services they deserve, because we are there for them. Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that actually brings us to the end of our session, which has been extremely rich. And thank you very much to all the panelists. To reiterate some of their points, resources are a challenge. We all know that. We're all facing that. But there's much cause for optimism. And from an ALNAP perspective, I would also remind everybody that the humanitarian sector is rich in learning on how to do this well. So don't disregard all the learning that already exists. It's a question of how to implement it and where the leadership for that sits, which we spoke about earlier. For everybody listening, thank you very much for your engagement and for your really interesting questions. We will be sharing the recordings and also the resources that have been referenced during this session. And please do keep in touch. It's a massively important discussion, particularly at this moment. So thank you all very much for your time and your engagement.